If you were a Native American child growing up in the 1970 seconds, your childhood looked very different from what kids know today. You grew up between worlds, one foot in a culture that stretched back thousands of years, the other in a country that was still trying to decide if you mattered. You learned early how to hold two truths at once, how to be proud and invisible, how to remember what others wanted you to forget. These memories aren't just nostalgia. They're proof that you were here, that your people survived, that the things they tried to erase, your language, your stories, your way of being lived on in kitchen tables and powwow grounds, and in the careful hands of elders who refused to let go. If you grew up Native in the 70s, you'll recognize yourself in these moments. And if you didn't, you'll understand a little more about what it meant to grow up holding on to something the world kept trying to take away. You'd wake up to it. That smell, hot oil and dough, sizzling in a cast iron pan your grandmother had used for 30 years. The sound was just as familiar as the smell, that crackling hiss that meant someone who loved you was already awake, already working, already making sure you'd be fed. Frybread wasn't fancy. It came from commodity flour, the kind the government gave out in those plain white sacks, the kind that showed up because of promises made and broken 100 years before you were born. But your grandmother's hands turned it into something else, something that tasted like home. You'd sit at the table, still half asleep, and she'd put a piece in front of you, still warm, sometimes with butter, sometimes with commodity peanut butter or jelly, sometimes with honey if there was any. And for those few minutes, the kitchen felt like the safest place in the world. You didn't know then that frybread itself was a symbol of survival, that it came from rations, from relocation, from times when your people had to make something out of nothing. You just knew it was yours. And that every time you smelled it, you were home. There was a way your grandfather worked. Quiet, steady, his hands moving over leather or wood or stone like they'd done it 1,000 times before. And they had. You'd sit near him, not because he told you to, just because that's where you wanted to be. And he never looked up and said, "Now I'm going to teach you something." He just worked. And you watched. Sometimes he'd hand you a tool, a scraper, a needle, a piece of sandpaper, and you'd try to copy what he did. He wouldn't correct you with words. He'd just take it back, show you again with his hands, and give it back to you. That's how you learned, not through explaining, through presence, through repetition, through the understanding that some knowledge doesn't live in words. It lives in muscle memory, in patience, in the quiet transfer of skill from one generation to the next. Your grandmother was the same way. She'd be beating, her fingers moving so fast you could barely follow. You'd sit beside her, and eventually, she'd hand you a needle and thread. You'd mess up, a lot, but she never sighed, never got frustrated. She'd just undo it gently and let you try again, because that's what elders did. They didn't lecture. They didn't test you. They just let you be near them until the knowledge seeped into you like rainwater into earth. Once a month, your parents would come home with boxes. Big, plain cardboard boxes filled with cans and bags and blocks of cheese that didn't look like anything you'd see in a store. Government-issued food, commodities. It was part of a system you didn't understand yet, but you knew it mattered. You knew it meant your family could eat. There was canned meat, peanut butter in a can, powdered milk, blocks of cheese so big you had to cut them with a knife, beans, rice, flour, all of it plain, all of it labeled in the most boring way possible. But your mother made it work. She'd take that commodity cheese and make the best macaroni you ever tasted. She'd fry up that canned meat with onions and potatoes, and somehow it was good. She'd take that flour and make frybread, biscuits, tortillas, whatever the family needed that week. You didn't feel poor when you ate. You felt fed. You felt like your mom was magic, turning these plain, government rations into meals that filled your belly and made you feel loved. But you also knew, maybe not in words, but in feeling that this food was a reminder of treaties, of promises, of a debt that could never really be repaid. And your mother carried that weight every time she opened those boxes, but she never let you see it. At home, your mother spoke in her language. It was the language her mother spoke, and her mother before that. It was the sound of prayers and stories and the names of plants and animals and places that didn't have English words. When she spoke it, it sounded like music, like the land itself was talking. But when you got to school, everything changed. You remember the first time a teacher told you not to speak it. Maybe she said it was disruptive. Maybe she said, "We speak English here." Maybe she didn't say anything at all. She just gave you a look that made you feel small and wrong. You learned fast. You learned that your language was something you had to hide, that it was okay at home, but nowhere else. That the thing your grandmother cherished most in the world was something the outside world saw as a problem to be fixed. Some kids had it worse. Their parents had gone to boarding schools where they were beaten for speaking their language, where it was literally punished out of them. And so those parents didn't teach their children because they didn't want them to suffer the same way. You felt the loss of it, even as a child. You felt the gap between what your grandmother knew and what you were allowed to know, and it made you angry, or sad, or both. But at home, when your mother spoke, you listened, and you remembered every word you could. Your clothes were a mix. Most of them came from older cousins, or from the church donation bin, or from the thrift store in town, if your family had a few extra dollars that month. You wore jeans that were a little too big, held up with a belt, t-shirts that had someone else's name written on the tag in faded marker, sneakers that were worn down on one side. But then there were the other things. Your mother's beaded barrette in your hair, a ribbon shirt your aunt made for powwows, moccasins your grandmother stitched by hand, a bolo tie your grandfather gave you, even though you were just a kid. Those items weren't hand-me-downs. They were made for you, with your family's hands, with your family's love. And when you wore them, you felt different. You felt connected to something bigger than yourself. You felt like you carried your people with you, even if no one else could see it. At school, some kids stared. Some kids asked questions. Some kids made fun. But you wore those things anyway, because they reminded you who you were and where you came from. And that mattered more than fitting in. The kitchen table wasn't just for eating. It was where your grandmother sat and beaded while the radio played low in the background. It was where your uncle sat and cleaned fish after a day at the river. It was where your mother paid bills, spreading out envelopes and receipts and trying to make the math work. It was where people gathered after a funeral, sitting in silence or talking in low voices, drinking coffee that had been on the burner too long. It was where you did your homework, even though there was never enough light and the table was always a little sticky. It was where decisions got made, where arguments happened, where someone always seemed to be laughing about something that happened 20 years ago. That table held everything, and if you close your eyes now, you can still see it. The way the light came through the window in the afternoon, the coffee stains that never came out, the crack in the wood that someone always said they'd fix but never did. It wasn't fancy, but it was the center of your world. There was nothing like a powwow. The drive there, your family packed into a car that barely ran, your mother holding a dish covered in foil because someone always brought food. The sun setting as you pulled into the dusty field where everything was already set up, the arbor, the benches, the vendors selling jewelry and frybread and strawberry soda. And then the drums started. You felt it before you heard it. That deep, rhythmic heartbeat that came up through the ground and into your chest. The singers' voices rising and falling, calling something ancient out of the earth. You watched the dancers, fancy shawl dancers spinning so fast their fringe became a blur of color, grass dancers moving like wind through a field, jingle dress dancers whose every step sounded like rain, men in full regalia, feathers and bells and beadwork that must have taken months to make. You wanted to be out there. Or maybe you were out there, in your own ribbon shirt or jingle dress, trying to keep up, trying to remember the steps your aunt taught you. The smell of sage, the smoke from the fire, frybread sizzling, dust in the air, your cousins running wild between the benches, playing tag in the near dark. And for those few hours, Nothing else mattered. Not school. Not bills. Not the way people in town looked at you. You were part of something that had been happening for longer than anyone could remember. And it was yours. You saw it happen more than once. Your father, strong, funny, respected by everyone on the res, would take you into town for groceries or supplies. And the moment you walked into that store, something changed. He got quieter, smaller. He didn't make eye contact. He said yes, ma'am, and no, sir, to people who didn't deserve it. You watched a clerk talk down to him, and he didn't say a word. You watched someone cut in front of him in line, and he let it happen. At home, he would have said something. He would have stood up for himself. But in town, he didn't, and you didn't understand why. Your mother did it too. She'd smile at people who didn't smile back. She'd apologize for things that weren't her fault. She'd keep her voice soft and her head down. It confused you. It made you angry. Why were they acting like this? Why were they letting people treat them this way? But you learned, eventually. You learned that this was survival, that making waves could mean trouble, that your parents were protecting you, protecting the family, by swallowing their pride and just getting through the day. And it broke your heart a little, because you knew who they really were, and you hated that the world made them pretend to be someone else. Your house always had music. Sometimes it was the country station, Johnny Cash, Loretta Lynn, Merle Haggard. Your parents loved that stuff. They'd sing along while they cooked or cleaned or worked on something in the yard. Sometimes it was the soul station, if you could pick it up. Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin, The Temptations, music that felt like it understood something your parents didn't talk about. And sometimes, late at night or on Sunday mornings, it was drum songs, recordings someone made at a powwow, or a tape your uncle brought back from somewhere. The sound of the drum and the singers, filling the house with something older than the walls themselves. The radio was always on. It was company. It was comfort. It was proof that there was a world outside your small corner of the reservation and that you were part of it. You fell asleep to it more nights than you could count. The low murmur of voices and music, your parents talking quietly in the next room, the sound of the wind outside. And it felt safe. Like nothing bad could happen as long as that radio was playing. If you had long hair, someone braided it. Your mother, your grandmother, your aunt, sometimes even your older sister, though she'd pull too hard and you'd complain. Braiding wasn't just about keeping your hair neat. It was a ritual. It was a connection. It was your mother's hands in your hair, gentle and sure, while you sat between her knees and tried not to squirm. She'd part your hair carefully, smooth it with her fingers or a little water or some kind of oil if there was any, and then she'd braid, slowly, evenly. Sometimes adding a ribbon or a beaded tie at the end, and while she braided, sometimes she'd talk about her day, about something funny your cousin did, about her own mother and how she used to braid her hair the same way. Or sometimes she wouldn't talk at all, and that was okay too, because the braiding itself was the conversation. For boys, braids were a statement. They meant you were proud of who you were, that you weren't going to cut your hair just because someone at school said you should, that you carried your culture in every strand, and when you walked into school with your braids, you knew some people would stare. Some would say things, but you also knew that when you got home, your grandmother would smile and touch your hair and tell you that you looked strong. Death was different in your community. When someone passed, everyone knew, and everyone came. The wake would last for days. People would gather at the family's house or at the community center or the church. There'd be food, so much food. Casseroles and frybread and stew and cakes and pies, all brought by people who wanted to help, who wanted to make sure the grieving family didn't have to worry about cooking. You'd see people you hadn't seen in months, relatives from other reservations, elders who drove hours to pay their respects, kids running around outside because they didn't know how to sit still with all that sadness. The adults would talk in low voices. They'd tell stories about the person who died, funny stories, mostly. Stories that made people laugh through their tears, because that's how you honored someone, by remembering them fully. Not just the sadness, but the joy. There'd be prayers, sometimes in English, sometimes in your language, sometimes both. And you'd feel the weight of it, even as a child. The way the community held each other up, the way no one grieved alone. And then there'd be the burial, the long drive to the cemetery, the songs, the smell of sage and sweetgrass, your grandmother crying quietly, your grandfather standing still as stone. And you'd understand, maybe for the first time, that your people had been doing this forever, saying goodbye, holding each other, refusing to let go of the ones who came before. There was a specific taste to commodity peanut butter. It came in a can, a big, plain can with simple black letters. And it didn't taste like Jif or Skippy or any of the stuff the other kids had. It was grainier, oilier. The kind of peanut butter that separated if you didn't stir it. Your mother would make sandwiches with it. Commodity peanut butter on commodity bread, maybe with a little jelly if you were lucky. And you'd eat it without complaining, because you knew it was what you had. At school, you'd pull that sandwich out of your brown paper bag, and sometimes you'd see other kids with their Lunchables, or their store-bought cookies, or their juice boxes, and you'd feel the difference. But you also knew other native kids who had the same sandwiches, and there was a kind of solidarity in that, a silent understanding. You didn't have to explain. They knew. And when you got home and your mother asked if you ate your lunch, you'd say yes, because you did. And because you knew she'd packed it with love, even if it wasn't what the other kids had. Years later, you'd taste peanut butter from a regular jar, and it would taste wrong, too smooth, too sweet. And you'd realize that the taste of commodity peanut butter was the taste of your childhood, and you'd miss it, just a little. There were adults in your life who didn't talk much about their childhoods. Your grandfather, maybe, or your great-aunt, or the old man who lived down the road and always seemed a little sad. You'd hear whispers, stories passed in low voices when they thought you weren't listening. About the boarding schools, about children taken from their families, about haircuts and beatings and being punished for speaking the language, about things no child should ever have to endure. Some of those elders carried it quietly. They never spoke about it directly, but you could see it in their eyes, in the way they flinched at certain sounds, in the way they held their grandchildren a little tighter, a little longer, as if afraid someone might take them away too. Others broke the silence, later in life. They'd tell their stories to anyone who would listen, because they wanted people to know. They wanted the world to understand what had been done, what had been stolen. And you'd sit there, young and trying to comprehend, and you'd feel a weight settle on you. The weight of history, the weight of survival, the weight of knowing that your people had endured something terrible and that you were here because they refused to give up. Those elders taught you resilience without ever using the word. They taught you that survival is an act of resistance. That holding on to your language, your culture, your identity, that's how you honor the ones who couldn't. There were smells that meant home. That meant ceremony. That meant something sacred was happening. Sage burning in a shell or a bowl. The smoke curling up, sharp and clean and earthy. Your grandmother would light it before important moments, before someone left on a trip, after someone came back. When the house felt heavy, when someone needed clearing, she'd fan the smoke with a feather, moving it over you, and you'd breathe it in, and somehow you'd feel lighter, calmer, like whatever bad thing you were carrying had been lifted away. Sweetgrass was different, softer, sweeter. It smelled like summer and prairie and something you couldn't quite name. Your grandfather would braid it carefully, each strand woven together with intention. And when it burned, the smell filled the room with something that felt like prayer. You didn't always understand the ceremonies. The words were often in a language you only half knew, but you understood the smells, and you understood that these smells meant you were part of something bigger, something that had been happening long before you were born and would continue long after you were gone. Even now, decades later, if you smell sage or sweetgrass, you're back there. You're a child again, standing in your grandmother's house, watching the smoke rise, feeling safe and sacred and seen. Sunday mornings were complicated. For some families, it meant church. Your mother would make you put on your cleanest clothes, and you'd pile into the car and drive to the small church on the edge of the reservation. You'd sit in hard wooden pews and sing hymns and listen to a pastor talk about Jesus and salvation. But even there, things were different. Sometimes the prayers were in your language. Sometimes the songs had a drum. Sometimes the sermon talked about Creator in a way that didn't sound quite like the Christianity you saw on TV. And after church, you'd go home, and your grandmother would smudge the house with sage, or your uncle would tell a traditional story, or someone would mention a ceremony happening next week, and everyone would start planning for it. You learned to hold it all: the Bible and the drum, the church and the sweat lodge, Jesus and Creator. Because that's what your people had always done: adapt, survive, take what worked and make it your own. Some people in your community rejected the church entirely. They said it was the colonizers' religion, forced on your ancestors, and they weren't wrong. But others found a way to weave it together, to be Christian and native at the same time, to pray in two languages and see no contradiction. And you, as a child, just accepted it. Because faith in your community was never just one thing. It was layered, complex, a mixture of survival and belief and hope and tradition, all braided together like your mother's hands in your hair. When there was a gathering, a feast, a birthday, a celebration of any kind, the whole community came, and everyone knew you. Not just your name, but your family, your grandmother, your cousins, the story of how your great-grandfather won a horse race 50 years ago, the time your aunt accidentally set the kitchen on fire trying to make frybread. You couldn't get away with anything, because someone was always watching. Someone always knew, and they'd tell your mother, and you'd be in trouble before you even got home. But it also meant you were never alone, never invisible. If you fell and scraped your knee, someone's aunt would clean it up and give you a cookie. If you looked hungry, someone would hand you a plate. If you looked sad, someone would sit with you and ask what was wrong. The elders knew you by name. They'd ask about school, about your siblings. They'd tell you to work hard and be respectful and remember where you came from. And at those gatherings, you'd eat until you were stuffed. Frybread and stew and salmon and corn and berry desserts and things you couldn't even name. You'd run around with your cousins until it was dark. You'd listen to the adults laugh and argue and tell stories that got more exaggerated with every telling, and you'd feel it. That sense of belonging, of being part of something that couldn't be broken, no matter what the outside world did. You remember the first time you held a piece of beadwork your grandmother made. Maybe it was a pair of earrings, or a barrette, or a small pouch with a geometric pattern in reds and blues and whites. And you turned it over in your hands, feeling the tiny glass beads, smooth and cool, stitched so tightly there were no gaps. You asked her how long it took, and she just smiled and said, "A while." You didn't know then that a while meant hours, days sometimes, that each bead was placed with intention, that the patterns weren't random, they had meaning, stories, history woven into every row. She'd let you try. She'd give you a needle and thread and a handful of beads, and you'd attempt to copy what she did. But your stitches were loose. Your beads wouldn't line up. You'd get frustrated. And she'd just take it from you gently, undo your work without judgment, and hand it back to you. "Try again," she'd say, not unkindly, just matter of fact. Because that's how you learned. Beadwork was patience. It was meditation. It was a way of passing time that didn't feel like wasted time. It was your grandmother's hands keeping busy, keeping connected to a tradition that went back further than anyone could remember. And when she gave you something, she'd made a gift, a piece of jewelry, a small token. You knew it wasn't just a thing. It was hours of her life, hours of her love, stitched into something you could hold. You'd sit in history class, and the teacher would talk about Indians. But they'd talk about you like you were gone, like you were something that existed in the past. Cowboys and Indians, Pocahontas, the first Thanksgiving. Maybe a paragraph about the Trail of Tears, if you were lucky. But nothing about you, nothing about your family, nothing about the reservation where you lived. right now, in the 1,970 seconds. You'd look at the pictures in the textbook, native people in buckskin and feathers, frozen in some idea of what Indian was supposed to look like. And you'd think about your dad in his jeans and work boots, your mom in her floral dress, your grandmother in her glasses and cardigan. You didn't look like the textbook, and the textbook didn't look like you. And when the teacher talked about what happened to the Indians, as if it were all in the past, you'd sit there, very much alive, very much present, and feel invisible. Sometimes you'd raise your hand. My grandmother's family was forced to move during, and the teacher would interrupt. That's nice, but we need to move on, as if your lived experience was a footnote, an interruption. You learned to stay quiet, to keep your family's stories to yourself, because school wasn't the place for the truth. School was the place where you were expected to learn a version of history that erased you. But at home, your grandfather would tell you the real stories, and you'd hold on to those, because they mattered more than anything in that textbook ever could. Your first pair of moccasins felt like nothing you'd ever worn before. Not like sneakers, not like the hard leather shoes you had to wear to church. Moccasins were soft. They moved with your feet. They let you feel the ground beneath you. Your grandmother made them, or your aunt, or someone in the community who was known for their leather work. They measured your foot, cut the hide, stitched it with sinew or heavy thread, and added beadwork if it was for something special. When you put them on, they felt too soft, too flexible. You weren't sure you could run in them, but you could. You wore them to powwows. You wore them at home. You wore them during ceremonies. And after a while, they became part of you. They molded to the shape of your foot. The leather darkened and softened with wear. And when you wore them, you felt connected to something. To the earth, to your ancestors, to the animal whose hide had become your shoes, given with respect and gratitude. Other kids at school had their sneakers, their Converse, or their Keds, and those were fine. But your moccasins were yours in a different way. They were made by hand, made with love, made to carry you forward while reminding you where you came from. Some winters were hard. The kind of hard where the cold crept through the walls and no amount of blankets seemed like enough. Where the heater didn't work, or there wasn't money to fill the oil tank, or the wood stove was doing its best but the house was too drafty to stay warm. You'd all sleep in the same room on nights like that. You and your siblings, and sometimes your parents too, piled under every blanket and quilt and sleeping bag in the house. The dog would squeeze in too, and you'd be grateful for the extra warmth. Your breath would fog in the air. Your nose would be cold, but under the blankets, pressed close to your siblings, you'd eventually get warm. Your mother would wake up early and get the stove going. You'd hear her moving in the kitchen, trying to be quiet, adding wood or lighting the old gas burner to make coffee. And slowly, the house would warm up. Enough to get dressed, enough to eat breakfast, enough to get ready for school. You didn't talk about it much. You didn't complain, because you knew other families had it worse, and because complaining didn't make the cold go away. But you also knew that when summer came, you'd sleep with the windows open, and the night air would feel like a blessing, and your mother would smile more. And your father wouldn't have to worry so much about keeping everyone warm. You learned resilience in those cold nights. You learned that comfort was relative, that survival sometimes meant just making it through to morning. But if you grew up native in the 1,970 seconds, you'll recognize something in these memories. Maybe not all of them, maybe not in the exact same way, but something. You'll remember the smell of frybread, the sound of the drum, the feeling of your grandmother's hands in your hair, the weight of knowing you were different, and the pride of knowing why. You'll remember that your childhood was shaped by survival. By poverty, yes. By discrimination, yes. But also by love. By community. By elders who refused to let their culture die. By parents who worked themselves to the bone so you could have something better. And you'll remember that you were part of something bigger than yourself. Something that couldn't be broken. Something worth holding on to. If you want more of these forgotten native memories, subscribe. There are more stories to tell, more moments to remember. More proof that we're still here, still standing, still refusing to disappear. Thank you for remembering with me.